At Cartoon Template for Short Story Craft, we have public domain cartoons. We have their 3-act breakdowns. And now we're going to review the what, when, and why of using these breakdowns as templates to better build our own short stories. First, we're going to talk about what is a template and why to use it. Then, when do 2 constraints get used in 3 acts across 4 parts? And finally, why is time cognizance pacing important? What is a template and why use it? The definition of a template is a pattern, mold, or the like, usually consisting of a thin plate of wood or metal, serving as a gauge or guide in mechanical work. It's anything that determines or serves as a pattern, a model. Examples would be a plastic stencil, woodworking jig for dovetails, or web page layouts. A cartoon template for a short story craft is a story structure pattern or model of a cartoon to serve as a guide for application to different story formats, genres, settings, and detail embellishments. Don't worry too much about being penalized for ripping off other stories, because there's already a strong industry precedent for such. And if Hollywood can make bank off templates, so can you. Why use a template? It provides simplicity, and from that simplicity, we are able to better create deviations. By developing a concrete idea of what's already been done, it allows us to better create deviations from that. Next, we'll discuss when do 2 constraints get used in 3 acts across 4 parts. Act 1 is the decision. Act 2 Part 1 is the situation. Act 2 Part 3 is where trouble develops. And Act 3 is where a solution is found. Act 1 sets up the scenario. It introduces all or most of the primary characters and presents us with the first challenge, the outcome of which is the first constraint. If the protagonist fails to achieve the first constraint, the story cannot proceed. Act 2 Part 1 primarily teaches us the nature of the characters and/or the situation, and presents us with the opportunity to introduce additional characters or story elements. Act 2 Part 2 is when most story elements and characters have been introduced. It is the time to develop those story elements and character relationships, and which is what creates the trouble. It will conclude at the emotional low of the film, where all seems lost and the protagonist is totally screwed. It's a total loss. Overcoming this situation is the second constraint. Failure to achieve the second constraint and the story is done. It's the screenwriter that achieves the constraint, most often with the protagonist, but sometimes with the antagonist. And last is Act 3, the solution. The second constraint is solved by either the protagonist or previously introduced purposeful side character or story element. If you pull something out of the sky, that is called the Deus Ex Machina, and is looked down upon. Try to avoid doing that. With the second constraint solved, the protagonist then begins to work towards overcoming the second challenge, which must be more difficult to achieve than the first challenge. The protagonist will work towards one of several final outcomes. It may be preferred where the protagonist wins and the antagonist loses, or it may be a complete surprise, such as everyone dies. Most often the conclusion will be definitive, but may provide leads to subsequent stories. The third and final section I'd like to discuss is why is time cognizance pacing important. Time cognizance, or time awareness, allows for optimal pacing of acts and subacts across the entire story. Stories may be free-form or have time limits. Free-form stories have writer-director defined time limits, but still benefit from time cognizance pacing to avoid ill-weighted, lopsided timing of emotional engagement across the story. Time limit stories have limitations placed by external factors. Festivals, contests, or grading criteria may stipulate that a film project must be at least X minutes long, or must be between X and Y minutes long, or maybe no more than Y minutes long. Commercial slots will typically specify 30 to 60 second runs, or there may be budget constraints where a production's cost per minute determines the length of the short. Knowing what elements speed up or slow down an act or subact allow for more control of overall story design. The fastest elements are decisions, where the protagonist chooses between option A or option B or more. If you have a scene, and you want to actually try to turn this into a story, you just want to get quick elements in to create a story around this. So you add a decision at the beginning, and you add a decision at the end, bam, you got a story, rather than a segment. The slowest elements in a story are songs, stories, and complex Goldbergian acts. If you have to create a short story that must last at least so many minutes long, you just can't think up of stuff. This is a part where you need to think of little songs to add to it, stories within the stories, or just make a simple act a lot more complex. In between those two are little time fillers. This can be achieved by having gags and little slice of life elements added or subtracted as needed to pad up or thin down your short story. And this concludes our cartoon template for short story crafts, what, when, and why. We have discussed what is a template and why use it, when do 2 constraints get used in 3 acts across 4 parts, and why is time cognizance pacing important. In the next episode, I will begin applying the story template of the first episode, Get Rich Quick Porky, to 3 different stories with randomly generated double genres, unique to each of the 3. Wish me luck. If you find this episode useful, please recommend it to others. And if you find the series useful, please subscribe. Thank you, and have a good day.